Hello and welcome to Heroes and Humans of Football. My name is Mehreen Khan.
And I'm Simon Cooper. This is the football show where we take the hero and we show you the human.
From Johan Cruyff to Megan Rapinoe.
And from George Best to Kylian Mbappe.
This is the Human Football Podcast.
Last week, we talked about how Paris and the ultimate sporting family made Kylian Mbappe. If you haven't already, be sure to check it out.
Today, we're discussing Roman Abramovich, a man who seemingly came from nowhere to change the face of football ownership in the Premier League while maintaining a mysterious relationship with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Abramovich is a multi-billionaire. At one point, he was the richest man in the UK, and then suffered a humbling fall that forced him to sell Chelsea, get blackballed on a Western sanctions list, and even, according to some reports, get poisoned for his attempts to broker diplomatic talks over the war in Ukraine. This is a story of a man who once sold rubber ducks out of a small apartment in the Soviet Union to become one of the most notorious oligarchs in the world, and none of it would have happened without football.
Yes, so after buying Chelsea in 2003, in the next 19 years, he won 19 trophies with them, spent an estimated 2 billion quid in transfer fees, and then when he had to sell the club, he made 0 pence on it. Didn't matter. At one point, the guy's estimated wealth was more than $50 billion. He reportedly owns the world's biggest private jet, a Boeing 767, and he paid out the biggest divorce settlement in history in the English courts.
It's a story dominated by lots of money, but also by football.
And it's a story of a survivor, of a man who, for all his wealth has made him a target. His life is about surviving, and Chelsea is part of survival.
So I'm a Chelsea fan.
I'm sorry.
I would say, a lot of people used
Why are you a Chelsea fan?
Zola, that's it.
Gianfranco Zola, when he came to Chelsea, you were like -2 years old?
No, I wasn't actually. I was in that phase that kids are when you need to pick your team. So Zola was the determining factor. There were lots of other factors which explain a lot of my personality, but that was key. Zola. This is also when Chelsea are not very good.
Yeah, and also it was a very perverse choice because as a British person of South Asian origin, you chose what was the most racist fan base in the UK to join.
Deliberately so. So I knew about this hinterland, the context in which I was operating. So if you are British Asian, you're probably going to support Manchester United or Liverpool, not because you live in those cities, but those are the teams that Asians support. And I thought, you know what? We're going to set the tone pretty early. I'm going to claim this racist club. It was them or Millwall.
It's very you to completely fly in the face of popular opinion, even as a child.
Yeah. I set the tone pretty early
Classic,
on.
Yeah,
Having said that, whatever reasons I wanted to support Chelsea, being a Chelsea fan for 15 years has been a hoot, right? It was like winning the footballing lottery. So I'm like 12 years old when Abramovich buys the club. He completely changes our fortunes within a season and a half. And then from then on, I spent most of my life denying that I'm a glory hunter because actually we were a little bit rubbish in the mid-90s when I decided that I was going to become a Chelsea fan. So in a lot of this episode, I'm going to expose how conflicted I am about Abramovich as a figure. And even in 2024, when it's definitely not politically correct to say this, there's a part of me that owes him some of the best memories of my life.
You love Abramovich. Is that putting it too strongly?
There's a little part of me that can't ever stop loving Abramovich.
Oh gosh, that's awful. Yeah, because I don't love Abramovich, but I do love this story because, as you say, he's a guy who touches on a lot of the dark side of the modern world. He is close to Vladimir Putin. He came out of the violence and chaos of Russia in the 90s. And he's part of this kind of Russian money that corrupts the UK in this century. And so he's always there. And even to understand the Israel-Palestinian conflict of today, he plays his role in that. So Abramovich is kind of also a story of the world we're in.
Abramovich, even now, is one of the most successful examples of sports washing.
Using sport to wash his reputation.
Exactly. We use this now all the time. It's a buzzword, right? So we talk about how Saudi Arabia, how rich countries in the Gulf are sports washing with various tournaments. But Abramovich did it really, really well. And, if someone who's apparently sane and well-adjusted like me is even able...
No comment.
With a straight face mount a defense of Abramovich shows how, distortive a lens football gives you on the world.
Yeah, well, this is a story of a very compromised man, a man who's knee-deep in dirt, who spends his life trying to wash it off and who uses football to that purpose. And I think one of the questions we're going to ask is, how much is he using football and how much does the guy actually love football? That's what we're going to go into. How much was buying Chelsea an act of pure cynicism? And how much was it just like a little boy buying a railway set? So where does this man come from? Compared to a lot of the people we talk about in this podcast, relatively little is known about his early life. So how does he grow up?
You're right. I mean, the details about his early life are a little bit patchy because often he rarely speaks about his own childhood. What we know is born in 1966, an important footballing year for some people, in this nondescript town in southern Russia. So he's a few thousand kilometers from Moscow in the south of Russia. Very importantly, he becomes an orphan at 2 years old, before his third birthday. His mother dies from blood poisoning, and his father, who's working in construction, also passes away.
Well, I think he dies in an accident, and the mother, I think, died in a botched abortion, because abortion was the main means of birth control in the Soviet Union where he's growing up. So this is a really bitter and bleak time. And so to be an orphan in the Soviet Union, not just that, to be a Jewish, short orphan in the Soviet Union, I mean, he's just kind of the guy who's going to get people beating up on him.
The chips are not on his side.
Yeah, he has to be very careful. And one thing he learns very early on in life is to be acutely sensitive to other people's desires and impulses. So he approaches people with this big smile, the smile you always see on his face in these pictures from the Chelsea terraces. His policy is disarm people, don't make any enemies, never have conflicts. And nobody who meets him in life describes him as outwardly nasty.
He's got this non-threatening air, which perhaps we can put down to the quite grim circumstances of his birth and his early life.
Because he's adopted there now as a toddler.
So he's passed between family members. His uncle is the first member of his family that sort of takes him up, and he goes to live with his uncle in a former town, Ukhta, which is created purposefully to house political prisoners. So penal colonies, as we now call them, which are going to be a recurring theme in the Abramovich story.
Middle of nowhere, 700 miles northeast of Moscow. And so these poor prisoners had to build their own town by hand. So, this is not Knightsbridge where he will end up.
Then his grandparents sort of take him in. He goes to military school. He ends up in Moscow, graduates with a law degree. And the world that Abramovich is graduating into is the slow-burning collapse of the Soviet Union.
I was there to witness in the early 90s. The Soviet Union has collapsed.
I'm not born.
You're just about being born at this point. I'm going around Moscow, summer of 92, and the USSR doesn't exist anymore. And what you're seeing is capitalism has arrived, but only a few people understand it. And so when I try and imagine Abramovich as a young man, he is this wheeler dealer, and you'd see a few of them on the Moscow streets. I remember this one young man who came up to us, beautifully dressed in a place where most people were wearing clothes from, 30 years ago. He spoke English, and he sold us tickets to the Bolshoi Theatre. And he was a guy who'd worked out what capitalism is. You buy low, you sell high. And Abramovich is one of these very early wheeler dealers in the Soviet Union at this point as a young man in his 20s.
So he's hustling, right? So now you're able to make money in post-communist Russia. And Abramovich needs to make cash, and he finds any potential which way to do it. So he's hawking stuff on the streets. One of the early successes he has is rubber ducks, of which there's great demand.
Brilliant. Yeah. Get into the rubber duck market. That's what I advise everyone.
Who would have known? But you throw everything against the wall, what's stuck? The rubber ducks. And he gets a decent amount of cash, and it actually helps him then diversify into a much more lucrative and way riskier business, which is oil trading.
Yeah, so the trick is the Soviet Union or Russia has a lot of oil, and you buy it cheaply because you know somebody who's willing to sell it to you cheap, and then you sell it at world market prices.
And there's a lot of borderline criminality that's involved in this business.
Yeah, you have to bribe people. That's how you get the license.
And there's even allegations that, have been held against Abramovich, which he denies, is that he was stealing tankers which were destined for other parts of Russia, taking them over and diverting them to other parts of Europe where he could get more money from them. So this is high risk, high reward sort of business, but he gets on pretty well, and he does start amassing a fortune. He's a big winner of what is almost the capitalism on steroids that Russia has become. This is the wild, wild east of 90s Russia, where it's known as shock therapy by economists, right? Because you just have extreme amounts of market liberalization almost overnight.
He really gets his big break when he meets this older oligarch, a guy called Boris Berezovsky. And this is the mid-90s. And they get together. I think Abramovich has to pay Berezovsky some money, and then they buy this massive energy company called Sibneft. They get it really cheaply. The state's auctioning it off, and they pay about $250 million each, which is nothing for, a huge slice of Russian oil. And they've made it big through their connections with the Yeltsin government. Abramovich and his sort of older brother figure, Berezovsky, they make it big. And Abramovich later admits, I had to pay millions in bribes to state officials to get the deal. Millions in bribes sounds like a lot, but the company they're buying is worth billions. So once they own Sibneft, Abramovich is a billionaire overnight. And so this relationship with Berezovsky, this older man who he's charmed, he does this one deal in his life.
Deal of the century is...
Well, it sort of is. I mean, Chryssia Freeland, who is a colleague of mine at the FT, the Financial Times, and is now Canada's Deputy Prime Minister, she wrote a book about it called The Sale of the Century, about how these oligarchs like Abramovich and Berezovsky buy up Russian assets. And so he has become, with this one deal, and it's really the only significant deal he'll ever do in his life. And later he and Berezovsky will fall out, and they'll fight it out in the most expensive civil lawsuit ever seen in the English courts. Spoiler, who wins? Roman does. And later Berezovsky either kills himself or is killed by somebody in his house in England near Windsor, I think. And so it doesn't end happily for him.
And he becomes a billionaire overnight. And I think, this is when the term oligarch is born, right? So in Yeltsin's Russia, you become an oligarch. So the commanding heights of the Russian economy is in the hands of a few men who have minerals, natural resources, raw materials that Russia has, and they control them, and they bought them for dirt cheap. And by buying them, they're also buying political influence with Yeltsin, who needs these people who also run the media in Russia now and who have huge amounts of political influence to keep Yeltsin in power. So it's a double benefit to it. You're very rich, you're very powerful, and the people in power are almost beholden to you. And that is the kind of story of Yeltsin's Russia and how oligarchs come about. They have a very intimate relationship with the then president of the country.
So it's in the 90s, out of that collapsing Russia, that Abramovich makes his wealth. But he knows he's on very dangerous terrain. I mean, there's constant murders of oligarchs. They go around with huge packs of bodyguards. He's surrounded by really dangerous people. And then when Putin, who he doesn't necessarily know well, becomes president, Abramovich gets very close to him quickly. But Abramovich always knows, I'm surrounded by people who can kill you in an instant.
And oligarchs, even though they've managed to amass huge amounts of wealth and power overnight, are hugely resented in a country which is becoming poorer all the time. 1990s Russia under Yeltsin is not a happy place. People are getting poorer. There's poverty everywhere. One stat says that the average life expectancy for a Russian man falls from 70 to 60. And this causes a huge amount of resentment from ordinary Russians to the oligarchs who have taken control of the country's huge amounts of assets. People hate you because they think you've robbed their country. And when Putin comes to power, he actually comes to power promising to break the power of the oligarchs.
And so Putin becomes Russian president in 2000, right at the start of the century. And he calls the oligarchs into the Kremlin and he says, listen, guys, you got your wealth in very murky ways. You know what? You can hang on to it. But from now on, you stay out of politics, don't interfere anymore. And also, business belongs to me and my friends. All the future ripping off the state, me and my mates are going to do that. You're not going to get involved at all. So you can keep your wealth, but stay out. Now, some oligarchs don't get the message, but Abramovich is a survivor. This short Jewish orphan who's learned his whole life to watch out for dangerous people. He gets the message very quickly. Putin is not going to let us play around. So I'm going to be nice to Putin and I'm going to keep my wealth.
In 2000, which is the same year that Putin gets elected, Abramovich runs for governor of a very, very far away region called Chukotka, which is in Siberia. And there's no reason anyone would have heard of it. It's basically the frontiers of the country. It's closer to the Arctic Circle than it is anything approaching civilization.
It's probably minus 35 degrees there right now as we speak.
They call that summer.
Yeah.
And it's huge. Right? It's 5 times the size of the UK and its population is rapidly falling. So it falls something like less than 300,000 people because people are poor, there's nothing to do and they're freezing. Abramovich, in good democratic style, runs for governor and wins 100% of the vote, which probably gives him a skewed sense of what democracy means. But, one thing that he does do is he pumps hundreds of millions of dollars into this
his own
region.
money, right?
His own money he's using as governor. And he's building hospitals, schools, cinemas, ice rinks, a shopping centre. I mean, he spends a few weeks in Bavaria and Germany at Oktoberfest, so he builds a German restaurant in the middle of Chukotka. And, there's a couple of competing reasons as why this guy who's got a stranglehold on the region, it's not like they're going to vote for anyone else. It's actually spending so much money in the region. And this is an early example of corporate social responsibility, Putin style. Abramovich is spending the money to show Putin, you know what? I'm not like the other oligarchs who only care about themselves.
Do you want me to run a region in the middle of nowhere where it's extremely cold? Yeah, sure, I'll do it for you, boss.
I'll do it and I'll spend my own money building it because this is Russia and we are all Russians, right? So there's some sense of nationalism and philanthropy.
And Vladimirovich, he says to Putin, please don't throw me in jail for the rest of my life.
And in 2003, we all expect Abramovich to get another one of these regional outpostings, but it doesn't happen. He survives. He's brought back into the fold. And 2003 is going to become a very, very important year. It's the third year of Putin's term. It's the year that Abramovich is going to buy Chelsea. And he also is alleged to have spent lots of money procuring assets like yachts for Vladimir Putin.
One allegation against Abramovich is that he is partly in charge of handling Putin's personal assets, his personal money.
So, Chukotka, I think we can say that this begins a period in which Abramovich realizes that spending lots of money is a great way to bolster your reputation. The people of Chukotka to this day love this guy, right? They talk about him in glowing terms.
He's the only person who's ever done anything for them.
Exactly. And, using his own personal wealth to do it.
Admittedly, personal wealth that he arguably stole from the people of Russia, but there you go.
Well, there is perhaps, the enduring story of, philanthropists, rich patrons from the Medici onwards who make their money in nefarious ways, but then use it to try and make themselves the good guys. And I think this is an early example in his political life, his only real political identity, which is being a governor of this faraway region, where he realizes you can use money to win loyalty. And the money he spends, the philanthropy he's doing, is also a way to keep him on the right side of Putin, because he can show Putin that he's a good oligarch, right? He's got a sense of responsibility to his nation, and he's willing to suffer and freeze in Siberia for his country.
So buying people's enduring love and loyalty brings us on to Chelsea.
And me.
And you.
It's 2003. I am a young Chelsea fan. We're basically crap. But at the end of that season, in May 2003, it's the final game of the season. If Chelsea beat Liverpool at home, they qualify for the Champions League.
And make a lot of money, which they need to avoid going horribly bankrupt because they have enormous debt.
We are debt-laden. The owners don't really know what to do with the club. We've still got the legacy of trying to build a stadium and bought a lot of players over a few years. I was so nervous for that game, the Liverpool game, that I left the house. But we win at 1-0. Jesper Grønkjær.
Legendary Jesper Grønkjær.
Whole Danish icon scores the goal.
Ajax, yeah.
And then little do we know, but this does actually change the fate of the club. And in 2003, Simon, you're a sports journalist covering football and keeping a close eye on Chelsea.
Yeah, because, are Chelsea even going to survive? And meanwhile, this man, Roman Abramovich, who's well known in Russia, but totally not in the West, unbeknownst to us all, is kind of descending on European football. He wants to buy a club. He has, some say at that point, $50 billion in assets. And he starts looking for a club, first in Spain, obviously, but ownership there looks complicated in Spain. You can't buy Real Madrid or Barcelona. They're owned by their supporters. In Italy, a lot of families who own clubs have been doing business with each other for centuries, and he's not kind of welcome in that close circle. So he starts to look at England. And there's this good book about him by Dominic Midgley and Chris Hutchins. And they say, look, spring 2002, obviously he's going to buy Manchester United, right? Biggest club in England. And he flies in to watch United. And after the game, Rio Ferdinand drives into Manchester Airport. And Abramovich, who's always charming people, he charms Ferdinand by joining in a sing-along with Ferdinand's 4-year-old kid cousin.
Carpool karaoke with Roman Abramovich.
That kid is probably still dining off that story now. But he doesn't end up buying United because it's not in London. And London is where he's descended. He's bought himself a nice house, I think, in Knightsbridge. Doesn't really want to go to Manchester all the time.
So let's roll back a little bit, because I am too young to remember this. But is there a sense that English football clubs are for sale at this point?
No foreigners, I think, in 2003 have bought a club. So
exactly.
This is totally new. So we're not expecting a Russian to show up. At this point, there are no sheikhs, no oligarchs, no Glazer family who have bought English clubs.
So when you say obviously he was going to buy United, why was it obvious? Just
well,
because...
to him, here's a guy with $50 billion, and you want to buy a club in England just for fun. Well, obviously, you're going to buy the biggest one, right? And how much can it cost? A couple of billion, no big deal. It's like me buying a cup of coffee as him buying United. But as I say, doesn't want to have to go to Manchester all the time, long way from London, even by private jet. So he starts looking around London. And I was in Moscow for the World Cup 2018, and I met this aide or former aide of Abramovich called German Tkachenko. And Tkachenko says, he tells the story of, they obviously start with Spurs, because Abramovich is Jewish, Spurs have Jewish connections, and he thinks that would be nice. So they drive up to check out Spurs, and they drive. It's
White Hart Lane, right?
White Hart Lane.
For anyone who knows London, in the depths of Haringey.
Yeah, not far from where my dad lives. Streets blocked, burger and kebab places, and not very welcoming, and a million miles away from Knightsbridge. So they're driving, and Abramovich reputedly says, This is worse than Omsk in Siberia. And
This is a
Tukachenko,
man who's used to being in the middle of nowhere.
Tukachenko told me, and I quote, he said, the journey was fucking terrible. And the story goes that not long after, he's flying in a helicopter over London, because of course,
That's the only way to get around in London.
I came here by helicopter this morning, by the way, myself, and he spots this football stadium handily located near Knightsbridge. And he says, what's that? Somebody says, oh, that's Chelsea Football Club, but they're rubbish. And Roman thinks, yeah, they're rubbish now. He negotiates to buy the club. I think he pays 60 million quid for the club, and he takes on 75 million in debt because you guys are, as I say, about to be flushed down the toilets of bankruptcy.
So are you telling me that if he looked at his helicopter a few minutes earlier, he would have seen Craven Cottage?
Would have bought Fulham.
And he would have bought Fulham.
Or Brentford. Yeah.
Or Brentford.
So he buys Chelsea with that crumbling stadium and club that's going nowhere. And he seals the deal with the passing Chelsea owner, Ken Bates, who was a very kind of, how shall I put this, unappealing figure. And so Abramovich has bought this football club. So how is he going to celebrate? He does the deal in the Dorchester Hotel in London with Ken Bates, and he drinks a bottle of Evian water because Roman Abramovich does not drink, or hardly at all.
Yeah.
And so he's bought this club, and of course the whole English media are like, what, this Russian has bought a football club? My colleague at the Financial Times, Matt Garahan, calls him up. Roman picks up the phone. And Matt says, so you bought Chelsea then? What's going on? And Rowan says, yeah, my favourite player is Thierry Henry. He's at Arsenal. I'd love to buy him. And at Chelsea, he says, I'm looking at it as something to have fun with rather than having to realise a return. I don't look at this as a financial investment.
Well, that's what we love to hear. He doesn't want to make money out of us.
And so he does that call with Matt Garahan. So the FT, the Financial Times, has this story. Abramovich speaks. And then Abramovich never speaks to a journalist again. Can you remember hearing his voice? You know what he sounds like?
I've never heard his voice. I've never heard him speak English. I think there are snippets of him around.
Sometimes he pretends he can't speak English and he has to have an interpreter.
Yeah, which is a pretty good trick.
Yeah, you'd think it would wear off. But anyway, he doesn't like to speak. And I think the reason is he figures out, and his advisors figure out, if you speak to a journalist, they can ask you, how did you make your money? And eventually, are you close to Vladimir Putin? And it's just difficult. So,
beyond Matt's chat with him, there is a sense in which I don't think he attracted much scrutiny from the English media, definitely not from the political establishment.
Because at this point, Russian money is coming into England and people love it. All these rich Russians, they're spending, the restaurants are doing great, the private schools are doing brilliantly. And isn't it funny, these Russians are a bit vulgar and they wear these weird
fur
outfits.
Coats and tracksuits.
But they're bringing all this money into London, and obviously Russia's going to become a nice democratic country, sort of like the Netherlands, and it's all good.
And it's also coinciding with a period where Putin is having his moment.
Yeah, Putin wants to join NATO.
Yeah, he's helping out the Americans in their war on terror. George Bush is saying that I looked into this man's soul and he's a good guy, trust me.
Looked into his eyes and I saw his soul.
Exactly.
Bush said. So yeah, Russians, everyone loves rich Russians at this point.
This is the high watermark of kind of Russians in the West, I think, the early 2000s.
So Abramovich is totally welcomed.
But the key question is, why does Abramovich buy Chelsea beyond the plaything narrative?
So there's various theories. And Catherine Belton, in her excellent book, Putin's People, she quotes this by Pugachev, who's a former Kremlin insider who's brutally ousted. He comes to the West. And Pugachev says, well, Putin told him to buy Chelsea. Putin said to Abramovich, that way you infiltrate into Britain and you win the hearts of the common people as well, and not just the elite. So you go, my son, you buy Chelsea, and it will become a kind of Russian asset. That's one theory. A more convincing theory I heard is, I know this Dutchman, Dirk Sauer, who became a media magnate in Moscow. And Dirk lived in this suburb where all the oligarchs lived. And one of his kids played football with one of Abramovich's kids. And so I said to Dirk, why, at the time, this is 20 years ago, I said, well, why has this bloke bought Chelsea? And Dirk said, he loves football. He said, I'll tell you the story about this football magazine I used to own. It was losing money. It was a nice little mag, but nobody bought it. It was going nowhere. And then one day somebody calls and offers to buy it from me. So Sauer sells the magazine, happy to have it off his hands. And eventually discovers that the person who bought it for him is just a front man for Roman Abramovich, who's bought this loss-making football magazine. And Sauer said it was his favorite magazine, his Bible. One of our reporters went to Chelsea to interview him, and Abramovich opened a cupboard and there were all these issues of the magazine. Typical Abramovich, he just wanted to have it. And Sauer said that's exactly why he also bought Chelsea. Sauer said, look, these people have money, but they don't have status. So what do? They buy status. It's just like the kind of robber barons in America in the 1920s. They bought art, they bought newspapers, and now these Russian oligarchs are doing the same thing. And Sauer said, Abramovich had to get his money out of Russia because Putin was taking complete control
It's a Putin-proof
of the
measure.
big money. So you move your money to England, you move your life to England, much safer being in Knightsbridge and watching Russia from afar, flying back in occasionally, being nice to Putin, but watching the whole Russian story from London feels a bit more comfortable. So Chelsea wasn't some cunning Abramovich venture to make money or anything. It was a kind of retirement hobby for a lifelong football fan. Putin probably thought, oh, that's nice. You know, he's bought himself a foothold in England. But Abramovich thought, this way, I'm out of business now, got something to do for the rest of my life. Because remember, when he bought Chelsea, he's in his late 30s.
Yeah. I mean, both theories can be true. So the Catherine Belton argument is that all oligarchs under Putin's dominion, tacitly or explicitly, are operating under conditions that Putin sets.
Yeah, Putin can take away their money at any second. They don't own their money, they're holding their money.
Yeah, on the face of it, it does very well. He can then go back to Putin and say, look, I'm sort of a de facto envoy for you because I'm going around and telling people that actually things in Russia are great. Russia at this point is getting incredibly rich. The oil prices is going gangbusters. So it's developing a middle class. Putin's very self-confident. And then Abramovich is kind of part of his network in the West, which is sort of presenting quite a benign sense of what this regime is like.
Yeah, has become a kind of go-between between Russia and the West. He's welcome in both places, and it's useful to have.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's by accident or by design, but that's what ends up happening, and that's the role that Chelsea play for him.
So it's 2003. He's bought Chelsea, a rubbish club, richest man in the whole football industry in the world. So he can do anything with Chelsea. You know, he can buy God and playing at centre forward.
All right, quiz question. Who's the first signing of the Abramovich era?
Tell me.
No clue?
Can't remember. Paulo Ferreira? No.
Close. Right back. You're right. In the Glenn Johnson from West Ham.
Ah, beautiful story.
Okay, so we've got Glenn Johnson, tick. But how does a man who otherwise knows nothing about football run a football club?
Yeah, well, he knows he doesn't know anything more about football than the average fan. I mean, he is just an average fan who has $50 billion. And so how does he take over this club where you have all these football people already working there? I mean, I think Claudio Ranieri is the coach. These people who are steeped in football. And how does he go in and tell them what to do? And Abramovich thinks, well, I know what I want. I want this attacking team with star players, but he's not sure that football is as simple as that. He just doesn't really know. But then what we see is another secret of his success. He's a good listener. I mean, the thing about Abramovich, which is part of why he succeeds, is he doesn't have a massive ego. He never has to be at the forefront. He's willing to hire people and take them seriously and listen to them. So he's at this, I'll say it again, at the time, rubbish club. He's the master of all he surveys, but initially he barely opens his mouth. And he doesn't really change much at the beginning. So as you say, buys Glenn Johnson and he lets Ranieri, who's the manager he's inherited, stay on for his whole first year. But then, you know, he gets his feet under the table and he hires his dream coach in 2004, who is
Jose Mourinho.
So he hands Mourinho this list of, you know, biggest players in football. And he says, you know, coach, I got all this money. Which of them do you want to buy? And Mourinho says, I don't want any of them. Because Mourinho doesn't like stars. He wants to be the big star and he wants players who will listen to what he says. And Abramovich is really disappointed. He's like, you know, I could have assembled this all-star team, been so much fun. Galacticos, but he thinks, well, Mourinho, this Portuguese guy, he seems to know about football. People tell me he knows about football. So he says, go for it, man. But it's a sign of Abramovich's quality that he owns this thing, but he has a small enough ego that he can work with a big ego like Mourinho. And it works. Mourinho wins 2 straight league titles. Chelsea's first in 50 years. Your first in your life.
I was gassed,
How was it for you?
Oh, it was so good. I just can't even, nothing compares to winning that first title. We conceded 19 goals that season, which is the fewest tally that any Premier League winning club has ever conceded, which shows you everything about the nature of the football. Score, don't concede.
And so this makes life sort of harder for Abramovich because Mourinho is the king of football. He's the most successful coach. And Abramovich knows that Mourinho and all these other football executives working at Chelsea are just going to try and keep the owner in his box. So whenever the owner will ask for something like, you know, guys, why don't we buy Shevchenko? Because he keeps saying that. The executives will say, yeah, but you haven't played, so you don't know how it works. But he's vulnerable because they come to him all the time saying, I want you to buy him, I want you to do X. And of course, one of the problems in football is that often football people are connected to particular agents. So Mourinho's house agent sort of is Jorge Mendes, the Portuguese agent. And so Abramovich thinks, well, these guys are telling me to buy these players. How do I know if this is solid advice. Should I be listening to them? So he needs to develop his own football knowledge. He needs to acquire it outside Chelsea. He can't just have Mourinho telling him about football, because then he's just going to be in hock to Mourinho and guided by Mourinho. And so Abramovich loves Dutch football, totally correctly. I grew up in it. It's the best football in the world.
Another redeeming feature, you see.
Yeah. No, he has redeeming features. And he finds this aged scout, Pete de Visser, who at that point is in his 70s. De Visser is now nearly 90, but he's still a football scout. And he says to Pete, you're going to be my private teacher. And for years, they travel around Europe together. Sometimes they watch 3 games in a day. De Visser has actually written about their cooperation in his Dutch autobiography. And he writes, I know that Mr. Roman doesn't really want to talk about him in my book, but I am 80 now, so I think it must be possible. And I actually know how secretive de Visser was, because the first time I ever saw Messi was 2005, this tiny Argentinian kid, smaller than anyone else in the field. And I'm sitting next to de Visser, and we're talking about, and he's telling me about Messi, what an incredible player he was, and I should watch this young kid. And I said to de Visser, yeah, you scout for Chelsea, don't you? And he went, well, some people say that. Don't say that. Don't write that. And so we spent the whole game talking about Messi, but not about Chelsea. And so de Visser, he becomes Abramovich's personal tutor. And he's had lots of illnesses, so his stomach has been taken out, so he can't eat any foods. So on the yacht, because if Abramovich likes you, he brings you onto his yacht, and you hang out on the yacht. And Abramovich tells the chef, strain every meal of de Visser's thin so he doesn't have to eat any actual food. And de Visser is so moved that he says to him in his Dutch English, I scout you another Ronaldo before I die. Because de Visser thinks he's going to keel over at any point in time. In fact, as I say, he's still going strong. He's nearly 90, and he's probably watching the kind of under-15s World Cup in Gabon or something as we speak. And so they follow Euro 2004 from Abramovich's yacht, of course, which is off the coast at Lisbon. And in the mornings, Mr. Roman knocks on Pete's door, and they watch replays or match situations together, and they scroll through it 3 or 4 times. De Visser is explaining football to him. De Visser says he was a quick pupil. Never have I seen a man with so much intellect and such pure love of football. Mind you, I'd say that if I were working for a billionaire.
Fair.
And after about 4 years, Roman's obviously thinks, well, I'm done now. And he says, Pete, thank you. Now I know enough. So he's upskilled himself. He's become a football expert. But he also goes to the Chelsea players because he thinks they can give me advice. It's not what the executives or the coach is telling me.
Yeah.
So he keeps going to Frank Lampard and John Terry, are kind of the Chelsea stalwarts. And sometimes minutes after a game, Abramovich will come up to them and say, what did you think? What did you think? And Lampard is a typical British footballer. He doesn't really like offering his opinions to higher-ups. But Abramovich says, no, you have to tell me, because he needs sources of information other than the coach. And so sometimes Lampard will say, well, this teammate, he's not good at X, not good at Y. And Abramovich will say, so why don't you tell him? So he's learning and learning stuff. And of course, people like Lampard and people in football, they love him. As you say, it's completely uncritical acceptance. Lampard's family gets invited on holiday on one of the yachts. And one day, Abramovich brings pots of Russian caviar. So just like Russian caviar, like other people have pots of peanut butter. Lampard's sitting on the yacht scoffing pots and pots of caviar. And so people in football think, wow, he's rich, therefore he's successful, therefore he's brilliant, therefore I admire him. And I also think he dresses well and he's a nice guy.
I mean, he's a perfect owner, right? So the players speak about him coming, they lose, he comes to the dressing room, but he's not berating them. He's sort of sitting in the corner saying, you've got to do better next time, guys.
Small ego.
Yeah, very
ego.
small. When they win trophies, even the Champions League in 2012, they're kind of forcing him to come up to pick up the trophy with his son. Otherwise, he's just sitting in the back, clapping in the stands. And then there's also the dark side of Abramovich. So John Obi Mikel, who's a player that Chelsea acquire by beating off Man United, and there's some dark circumstances, but while he's at Chelsea, his family gets kidnapped in Nigeria, and he's going through it, and Abramovich just comes up to him, taps him on the shoulder in his very non-threatening way, and be like, "Look, I know people that can get your family safe. Like, I'll bring in the heavies. Just give me the call. It'll get done." And so there are the sort of snippets of the power and influence this man has, and the kind of slightly dodgy dealings and networks that he has when he can come and secure diplomatic releases of kidnapped parents of footballers.
Yeah, and he, even as he's now the most powerful man in football, he retains this kind of non-threatening, make no enemies policy that he'd learned, growing up rough in Russia and then making it big in this very rough place. He's always nice to everyone. I spent a lot of time around Chelsea in those early Abramovich years, and I knew some of the people who worked at the club. And I was collecting testimonies, what do people think of Mr. Roman? And so they like this, as you say, this very understated, style, this very rich man. So Guus Hiddink, who was Chelsea coach in periods, said, very quiet man, he says this about Abramovich, no urge at all to profile himself, not look how important I am, what I have and what I can do. It was even below that, wearing jeans and a very normal watch, even less than normal. So Hiddink's like, this guy is cool. But, over time, Abramovich starts to assert himself because he's tired of not having any stars. He's bought football to buy some really great players. He loves that. And so against the advice of some people at Chelsea, he goes out and he buys Shevchenko, buys Michael Ballack, and disastrously they do get Fernando Torres. They spend 50 million quid on him just when Torres has reached the end of his useful years. They buy him from Liverpool. And, the executives of Chelsea are tutting behind the doors like, oh my God, the owner has gone and bought Shevchenko. And these things don't work out. And one Chelsea exec told me we had to give him his way a couple of times to teach him that buying stars is not always the answer. And the stars he buys, they tend to flop, Shevchenko and Torres. And so then he kind of learns a bit more humility.
There's also the disastrous and brutal firing of managers. So Mourinho leaves in his third season, in the middle of the season, and Roman decides it's a good idea to have Avram Grant, who's one of his mates, sort of adjacent to football, run the team for the rest of the season.
Well, Abraham Grant, whatever you say about him, he very nearly wins the Champions League, which shows how managers are much less important than we think.
I mean, at this point, player power is everything at Chelsea. So Lampard, Terry, Drogba's checks, they're running the dressing room. They don't even need a manager. And to some extent, that's what the Abraham Grant episode proves, and later Di Matteo. But it also creates, I think, ultimately what became quite a counterproductive culture, because when the players didn't like the manager, they'd call Abramovich and be like, not him, and he's gone.
So he's getting into firing managers, and he fires Mourinho, but he still wants to keep him close. He doesn't want to make enemies. So when he sacks Mourinho the first time around, he gives him this rare Ferrari as a goodbye present, because Roman's whole life is, I don't want you to hate me, so I'm going to spend some money so that you won't hate me. And he has this kind of small court of people who work for him, people like the scout Peter Visser, or his right-hand man Eugene Tenenbaum, who's a Canadian-Russian. And he does a lot of his decision-making on his yacht. So if he doesn't invite you on his private plane to fly to Saint-Tropez on a whim or to hang out on his yacht, you're not a member of the court, so you don't really matter. So you need to be on the court. When you speak to Chelsea decision makers, they were often puzzled because they were scared of Abramovich. And so they'd call him Mr. A, or they'd call him the owner, and they'd speak about him in quite oblique terms. But they were also always trying to work out what he actually wanted, because usually he wasn't there. He was away on his yacht. But he was the autocrat, the sole decision maker. So this one Chelsea director, he said to me, well, people will come up to me and says, the owner wants this. You better do this. And the director said, I don't know. Maybe he wants that. Maybe he doesn't. Who knows? Because it was very hard for them to get access to him. You have this very weird situation where the key decision maker of the club isn't really there.
So he occasionally buys shiny new players that he likes because it's nice to splurge a little bit. But what kind of team does he want Chelsea to be? Because they're not the Galacticos. They have a few peppered here and there. They often fail. So what should Chelsea, the football team, look like for Abramovich?
Well, I got this clue when I interviewed Carlo Ancelotti. He was then at Real Madrid, but Ancelotti had come to coach Chelsea in 2009, been hired by Abramovich. And years later, Ancelotti told me, the first time I met Abramovich, he said, when I see Chelsea, I don't recognize it is Chelsea. I don't recognize the identity of the style of play. So I think what he wanted is a team sort of like Barcelona, playing beautiful football that when you watch 3 minutes of it, this is Chelsea, this is typical Chelsea football. And he never really got that, I think, or very rarely did Chelsea become that kind of team.
So Ancelotti
that was his dream.
Does that in his first season. He wins the Premier League. In the second season, they're a bit rubbish, and he sacks him in the tunnel the last game of the season at Everton. So I would say that if you had to define what Chelsea became under Abramovich, it's just about winning.
It becomes just about winning, but that wasn't the original dream.
Of course, but I think Abramovich realizes that it's probably easier just to win playing the kinds of football that get you to win than it is to develop this very strong identity, because that also relies on keeping your managers around. And he can't do that. He doesn't have the patience.
Yeah, but I think the man who also sets the tone for the new Chelsea much more than Abramovich is Mourinho. Mm-hmm. And Mourinho is about winning. And the fans are very happy with just winning. It's all you guys want, right?
And one of the reasons Abramovich is still held up so high is because he won.
Another interesting thing I find about the way he runs the club is for a long time, the two most powerful executives beside the coach are a woman and a black man. So you got the director, Marina Granovskaya, who's also Russian-Canadian, and she had been Abramovich's personal assistant. And she ends up running the club. She's kind of managing director.
He wins an award called football man of the year because she's
Football
an
is terrible, isn't it?
absolute ball-busting negotiator when it comes to transfers.
She's highly
She's
competent.
formidable. I mean, you hear people speak about her in terms, I mean, she had the male football establishment running scared. She made a lot of enemies, but she was brilliant at just extracting money from for players.
Well, one of the stupid aspects of football is that women and black men are not allowed to have those jobs. I mean, that's where Abramovich is much more smart about how he runs the club, that he just looks at talent. Granovskaya, brilliant executive, and his technical director is a Nigerian called Michael Emelano.
As a scout or somebody whose job it is to think about talent, Emelano does incredibly well, and I don't think Chelsea have ever really replaced him either.
And so we need to give Abramovich credit for bucking the sexism and racism that is almost ubiquitous in football. I mean,
he's an outsider, so I guess he doesn't mind having outsiderish figures, disrupting the game.
And, as you say, they do win everything. They do win the Champions League in the end. They win it twice under Abramovich. It turned out that his bet on buying Chelsea was exactly right. Going to London, sitting out the Putin era in much safer London, nice hobby in football. He does sports wash his reputation, as you say, until the invasion of Ukraine, which we'll come to. Almost everyone in England loves him. And he's right to stay out of Russia. Putin and his friends start taking over business. There's no space anymore for oligarchs like Abramovich. So he still flies into Moscow. He likes being there, but it's more comfortable to watch Putinism from a safe distance.
There's a brilliant press conference with Putin in the 2010s when Russia are going for their World Cup bid. And he's asked by a journalist whether he wants to recruit Abramovich as part of his campaign. And sort of Putin sort of smirks and says, yes, obviously we'll see if there's a role for him. He's got plenty of money. I'm sure he can use some of it to help us or to build up the infrastructure. And that sort of, is a bit of a nod and a wink to the fact that even though Abramovich is quite far away and seemingly, away from the other clique of oligarchs, that there's still a relationship there. It was more like I'm a kind of watching you sort of comment made in public than it was, celebrating his achievements.
So Abramovich is living his best life in London. He's pumping a bit of his money into Chelsea, winning prizes, enjoying life in Belgravia, in his mansion. And he's keeping friendly enough with Putin, not getting in any trouble back there. But pretty soon, he is about to experience a terrible fall from grace that starts in the English cathedral town of Salisbury.
Stick around to find out how.
After the break.
Are you loving listening to Heroes and Humans every week? Do you hate the wait between our weekly episodes? If so, why not join our official H&H Supporters Club on Patreon? This exclusive community is the place for behind-the-scenes sneak peeks, Q&A opportunities with me and Simon, and more bonus content. The link is in the episode description and on all our social media bios. This is a reminder that you're listening to the Heroes and Humans of Football podcast with me, Mehreen Khan.
And me, Simon Cooper. So you're joining us as everything is about to change for Abramovich. He's risen to huge success in football, happiness in London, and now he is about to fall. So we're in 2017. Chelsea win their fourth league title of the Abramovich era. But within a year of winning that 2017 title, things start going horribly wrong for Abramovich. Mehreen, talk us through it.
Sergei Skripal. And I think lots of people in the UK will remember that name. And he becomes ubiquitous after he's poisoned along with his daughter, Julia, in the cathedral town of Salisbury. And it's a botched poisoning with the deadly Novichok agent. Now, Skripal is a former Russian agent. And the fact that there is an attempt on his life made
by other agents who've actually travelled up.
It later emerges that the people that are trying to assassinate him are also members of the Russian intelligence services. And so the idea that there's a potential extrajudicial killing happening on British soil by Russian intelligence services linked to the Russian government sends, shockwaves through the British foreign and political establishment.
Theresa May, the Prime Minister, is outraged. How dare they do this on our
And of
soil?
course, this is a country and a government and a political class which has been incredibly accommodating to rich Russians who have or may not have links to Putin. And everything sort of changes around the Skripal assassination. Crucially for Abramovich, who's living on this sort of rich man visa. So Britain, like many other countries, if you invest and spend a lot of money in this country, the UK will give you, the so-called golden visa. He decides that he's not going to extend his visa. Well, that's the formal excuse given.
The Brits tell him, we are not going to extend your visa, Mr. Abramovich.
Behind that is the fact
get out of here
that
fast.
He's not going to have his visa application rejected, and therefore he quickly starts making contingency plans about how to get out to the UK. And this is also at a moment where the club is doing well. He's got plans to build a new stadium. They think it's going to be in Battersea Power Station. There's going to be a lot of money pumped into the other parts of the club, which is like the infrastructure. And all of this gets put on hold. After 2018, without his visa, he's no longer able to attend games, attend home matches for Chelsea.
Yeah, I think, there's 3 years where he doesn't go to games?
Never seen at the games. He will appear at random European away fixtures because he later acquires Israeli and Portuguese citizenship, but he's not seen at the bridge ever again.
Yeah, so he's looking to get out of the UK. He knows his happy time there is over. He sort of starts to separate himself as well from Chelsea. I think for 3 years in 2018, the Athletic, the website, he doesn't even go to the UK. So the Skripal poisoning breaks his link with London.
But he doesn't sell the club. There's a cloud hanging over him as a figure. And I know the fans and everyone around the club is thinking about whether he's going to stay. But he does stay. They win a Champions League in 2021.
It's the last great moments of the Abramovich era.
Yes, it is. And this decline accelerates hugely on the 24th of February, 2022, where after months of threatening to do so, Putin finally invades Ukraine with Russian troops. Abramovich hears about it.
In his chateau on the French Riviera, which must have been shocking news for him because it was not what he wanted.
It's like those stories about when World War I breaks out and, the gilded age of British aristocrats, and people just don't realise that this is really a thing or two is going to last very long, or what the consequences of it are. But actually, the action is pretty swift. And surprisingly to many people, so I was covering this in Brussels at the time, Western governments show a huge amount of resolve to place Russia under financial sanctions.
And especially these rich Russians living in the West.
From going off financial sanctions, so they try and basically cut Russia out of the global financial system, which proves difficult. But very, very quickly, the attention turns on rich Russians who've been living in the West, sending their kids to private schools, skiing in the Swiss Alps. The penetration of Russian money in Western countries is then, massively under scrutiny after all of the kind of serious political stuff.
And the most famous Russian living in the West is Roman
Abramovich.
Yeah, because of football.
Yes.
So the UK government have to sanction him.
He is the biggest scalp, right? There's plenty of Russians that make it onto the sanctions list, but the one that really cuts through is Abramovich.
So the UK government researches him more thoroughly, and they put out this report and they call him a pro-Kremlin oligarch who has had a close relationship for decades, I'm quoting here from the report, with Putin. And the government says he gets all sorts of benefits from Putin's government, including tax breaks, and he got contracts in the run-up to the World Cup in Russia in 2018. His companies were helping build stuff. And also, he controls a steel group, which may have supplied steel for Russian tanks. So he is actually a financier of the
supply chain.
He's a supplier of the terrible Russian war machine, which is killing people in Ukraine. But, this is the weird thing. He's totally a war profiteer, but he doesn't support the war. He's not a violent Russian nationalist. Abramovich's whole life is, let's not fight here, people. Let's all be friends, and I'm going to keep my yacht, And so he hates this idea of a war because sanctions, he knows it's going to cost him a lot of his assets. They'll be sanctioned by the West and he might not be able to fly around Western countries as easily as before. And then he actually gets involved in peacemaking. And now this is partly a Jewish story. Mm-hmm. So Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, says, well, we need to reach out to Putin because this must be a sort of misunderstanding. We need to tell Putin, look, don't fight us. We don't want to fight you. Zelensky says, does anyone here know Abramovich? Because he's a friend of Putin's. And this Ukrainian Jewish filmmaker says, yeah, actually, I'm a friend of Abramovich. So Zelensky says, well, call him at once. So they call Abramovich and they say, could you go and talk to Putin and sort out this horrible misunderstanding? So Abramovich gets involved in these sort of peace talks.
Mediating, yeah.
Yeah, so-called peace talks between Russia and Ukraine.
This is probably the first time that Abramovich tries to push a political line with Putin, which is peace talks, and he doesn't want anything to do with it. And allegedly, Abramovich does get poked with a dose, not life-threatening dose, of Novichok for his troubles. And it's also kind of the paradox of what being a Russian oligarch is. You owe your life to Putin, but you have no say or sway over him. So while the British government and other governments are working out whether to get Abramovich on a sanctions list, and sanctions list in this context means that you have a travel ban and your assets are seized. Abramovich sees the tide turning and he tries to preempt this, and he announces a couple of weeks after the invasion that he is going to sell Chelsea in the best interests of the club. And the statement and the subsequent sale process is full of all of this sort of benevolent language that Abramovich wants the proceeds of the sale to go to victims of the war. He doesn't specify whether these are Russian or Ukrainian victims, that he's not going to make a penny from the sale, that he wants to write off the debts of the club, and he's going to put in all of these great conditions for the next owners, like building the stadium. All of the financial commitments that he's made will have to be taken on by the new owners, and that entire sale sale process is going to be managed by the British government.
And this is typical Abramovich, even in the most difficult of circumstances, try to make no enemies, don't upset the Brits, don't upset Putin, don't upset Chelsea fans, don't upset the Ukrainians. Very difficult tightrope to dance on, but that's what he's trying to do.
And for a while it works. So we already mentioned the Zelensky connection, but Zelensky also lobbies the US government to keep Abramovich off the sanctions list because he thinks that he can be a useful and constructive person in the mediation. Because in the early stages of the war, it's just not really clear what Russia's intentions are. And it's not also clear that Ukrainians can defend themselves very quickly. So there's a sense in which that they would have to cede a huge amount of territory very quickly to the Russians. And Abramovich is kind of in the sort of mix along with Turkey and other countries who could act as go-betweens between the two sides.
Yeah, and that's his historic role. Abramovich is a go-between between Russia and the West, and that becomes of world historical importance when the invasion happens.
So even in his last moments as a football owner, Abramovich is presenting his own world is collapsing around him as a good guy with good, noble intentions. He vitally uses the word war to describe what's happening in Ukraine. And this is a point which this is only referred to as a special military operation by Russians and in the Russian press, which shows already probably a degree of audacity that he hasn't shown for most of his life when we think about his relationship with Putin.
Yeah, although he'll very quickly go back to being everybody's friend again. But I think, looking back on his time in football, I think there were years when he was definitely passionate about football and really having fun and getting to buy Shevchenko, his
It's a brilliant
dream.
escapism for someone like him, right?
Yeah, it's your weekend hobby, running Chelsea or having a bit of a say in Chelsea. And then I think towards the end, he's forced out of Britain. He also probably loses a bit of interest. He's distanced from the club. He's done that already. He's won 2 Champions Leagues. He's kind of done with football, is my sense. And so looking back on it now, the guy has lost his club. He's finally got into trouble with Putin. He's finally lost his role of being friends with both the West and Russia. And he probably deserves all that for kind of getting into bed with a ruthless maniac like Putin. So, surely we should be saying this is a terrible man.
So one of the difficulties, even in 2024, when the relationship between Putin, his cronies, his entire network has been under huge amounts of scrutiny, the world's intelligence services, the entire, journalistic community has been looking at this, it's still quite difficult to really make clear connections between Abramovich and Putin financially. There have been things like the Cyprus files, which show that holding companies related to Abramovich have sold assets to holding companies that are linked to Putin's cronies. So that, establishing that clear financial link isn't possible.
We just don't know how much they have to do with each other.
And Abramovich, as I said before, not that much has stuck. However, there are other types of, so-called foul play that he has been involved in. And a couple of years ago, it was revealed that another one of these holding companies in the British Virgin Islands, which Abramovich owns, has spent at least $100 million funding Israeli groups which is accused of the illegal seizures and settlements building in East Jerusalem.
Yeah, they seize Palestinian homes and try to give them to Jews. And now with the war in Israel, it seems that Abramovich, and this has hardly been discussed, is also at the center of the Israeli-Palestinian war and what seems to me to be an Israeli attempt at ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. So he's really at the heart of so much that happens in the world.
He's a benefactor, and he's a huge and very generous benefactor. So in one sense, Abramovich has never really kept a secret of the fact that he is a big supporter of Jewish causes.
He's a proud supporter of Jewish causes.
Very proud supporter of Jewish causes. And, a bit like his dealings in Chelsea and later in Ukraine, again, he presents this as another sort of act of noble philanthropy. Now, the group in question, when we're thinking about illegal settlements, is called Elad. And, Abramovich's funding makes him easily the largest single donor to this group, who operate in quite sort of nefarious ways because notionally they look like a tourist organization who help people visit what they call the City of David around Jerusalem, but has also been accused by the European Union and others of promoting something called settler tourism because they promote a very exclusive and ethno-dominated history of this region, which says that this is a land that should belong to Jews. So again, we've got the plausible deniability element where Abramovich can say, I'm a good guy, I'm just giving money to charities who do nice things like helping promote the history of Jerusalem. And whatever they may or may not be doing for that money, it's still a little bit far removed. And he is able, again, not to make things stick.
Yeah. He doesn't like getting into trouble, which is difficult when you're that powerful a figure.
And now that he's sold Chelsea, other things are coming into light because Chelsea's new owners are revealing things about what happened under the previous administration under Abramovich, which include things like irregular payments made to agents or representatives linked to players like Eden Hazard, Antonio Conte, who was a former manager, Samuel Eto'o and Willian, who were both bought from, clubs they were previously under Russian clubs. And if Chelsea are found guilty of breaching financial fair play this season or next season, they could face a points deduction. So, the ghosts of Abramovich's past are still haunting the club and could still have sizable consequences for Chelsea today.
And meanwhile, he's not there. I mean, he's last I hear, it's very hard to keep track of his movements, but people say he's renting a mansion in Istanbul, he's doing house hunting in Dubai, he's spending time in Tel Aviv. So he's gone very, very far away from Chelsea.
And this is the kind of pain point about today and how we think about Abramovich, because I would argue that he is still a figure of huge adoration for Chelsea fans.
And for you? Now that you've researched this whole episode, you still adore him?
There's a part of me that probably will never be able to sort of disavow or condemn him because, again, he did a lot of good for the game. So the things we haven't mentioned so far already, he was a huge supporter of the women's game, something we'll talk about in subsequent episodes. He built up the academy. It's now one of the best in the world. Even when it comes to funding legitimate and I think noble Jewish causes, so he gives a huge amount of money to a museum not in West London to build up exhibitions against anti-Semitism. The club does a lot to combat anti-Semitism because it has these terrible reputations still to this day, Chelsea fans, when it comes to anti-Semitism.
Yeah, and it was a stadium where black people were not comfortable going very, very long time.
And if you're a Jewish person, shamefully, up until a couple of seasons ago, Chelsea fans would still hiss to represent the gas chambers every time we played Tottenham.
Yeah,
I mean,
disgusting.
This is the level of it's vile. And Abramovich,
so
to his
running the most anti-Semitic
club as a Jewish
fan base of any big club in England.
As a Jewish owner. So there's lots of kind of stories about his benevolence and his backing of noble causes. And that's something that he uses to defend himself. And I think, it's an uncomfortable truth, but I think a lot of Chelsea fans would have him back like that.
And they feel that he's one of them, right? They feel he is also a fan.
And now, it's thrown into even sharper relief by having a new ownership who ironically are spending almost more than $1 billion into the club, but we're now seen as part of a US private equity group and they want to make money out of us, and football fans hate the fact that they could just be another part of capitalism. Like the idea that your owners may want to make money from you literally turns so many fans off, which is why I think a lot of us would prefer to be playthings of oligarchs or
but the disgusting
governments.
fact is, you say playthings of oligarchs. The money that was stolen from the Russian people, the oil that should have belonged to all Russians, ends up being pumped into Chelsea to buy expensive footballers and win Champions Leagues for people like you. I don't see anything beautiful in that.
Exactly, and I think the whole quandary is that we do ignore where the money comes from, and people are very cynical about all rich people do nefarious things to become rich, but actually it's not true. Some of them are really, really, really doing dark stuff to get the cash. And Chelsea did, we did a very good job helping him reputation wash.
So you think the reputation washing of Abramovich through Chelsea, you think it worked?
A couple of seasons ago, when Premier League games were holding minutes of silence for Ukraine, Chelsea fans were ignoring the minute silence to sing Roman Abramovich's name.
Yeah, that's disgusting.
Right? So it's there, it exists, it's uncomfortable to confront, but I think it's true. And, the fact that he still cared about us even though he lost his visa and we still won a Champions League. All of this stuff is the things that Chelsea fans feel that can never be taken away from. And they feel aggrieved that their club was put into turmoil and forced into a sale in the middle of the season. And the fact that we've been crap ever since, people put it down to the original sin of forcing Abramovich out.
Do you see this man as somebody who gave you some of the best moments of your life?
Yes, sadly. And I think it's
tragic,
equivalent to the kind of things that only musicians or artists can do, right? Like the degree to which you're emotionally attached to them. That's why I think the Abramovich brand of sports washing is really powerful, because he was the singular figure that was associated with Chelsea. It wasn't the Qatari government. It wasn't the Emirati royal family. It was Abramovich. So all of the fealty and the affection and the love is concentrated on this single finger. And that's why
in fact, he was, in real life, he was a representative of the Russian regime.
Voila. But the fact that even now we can't really prove it, quote unquote, shows that I think until, the dust is settled on this and, Putin's not around and Abramovich is not around and then we read the history books about what really went on, I think there will still be this lingering affection. And that's why I think his sports washing model, I would argue, is more powerful than now all the other kinds of sports washing.
Yeah, everyone followed him. He pioneered sports washing. You buy a club, you're a billionaire who got money in murky ways, and you buy a football club and everybody loves you.
And it's your name.
And it's your name. And so the Saudis have done it with Newcastle, and the Emiratis have done it with Man City, Qataris have done it with Paris Saint-Germain, and it sort of works. I mean, they don't become individually popular like Roman, but they do improve their reputation a little bit. Yeah. So you're a massive Chelsea fan, but you're also a clear-eyed journalist. So looking back on the Abramovich era in football, now over, how do you see him? Who is this man?
I think the story is still not clear, and I wouldn't even rule out some rehabilitation, which is involved in whatever eventual settlement happens around Ukraine and Russia. I think his involvement in Israel and with settlements may now come under much more attention because that is another geopolitical hotspot, which is, I think, is almost overtaken Ukraine in sense of importance. But I can see him coming back. He's still incredibly rich. Again, nothing is really sticking. He's on a Western sanctions list, but he can maybe prove to be a useful asset for Western governments once Putin's not around, once people start thinking about what happens next. So I think that maybe that the story is...
Maybe there's a third and a fourth act.
Exactly.
But how do we look back on the life so far? Here is a man of 60 and he lit up the football world with his blinding lights. Now he's gone. How do you see his life looking back?
He's a survivor, right? I mean, barring any nasty end, this is a guy who's able to deal with incredible amounts of tumult, from being orphaned at the age of 2 to witnessing the collapse of Soviet Russia, getting incredibly rich, finding the right types of people to attach him to, and very, very, very importantly, making sure that he's on the right side of somebody who's become one of the most powerful people in the world.
Yeah, and who he has been very, very close to, even interviewing members of his cabinet, so staying on the right side of Putin for so long.
So there's a canny and an ouse there, which kind of belies his somewhat, that kind of silly sort of smile that he does. I mean, he's have this almost childlike quality. When you see him watching games, he's got this he radiates nervousness.
You've
right?
watched him in the VIP box.
Yeah, he's just like, he's trembling. Like it reminds me of me when I was much younger watching football matches. Like I just can't contain myself because every shot, every tackle, every this, he's living the game. But underneath that is somebody who's able to navigate very treacherous terrain and probably deserves some props for that, because plenty of others have fallen.
Even during the Ukraine war, he's managed so far to get out of it comfortably. So, yeah, I mean, you have to admire the survivor skills.
So that was our take on Roman Abramovich, a man who spent most of his life using his money to win over friends and gain influence.
And ended up with no friends.
Except Chelsea fans.
Thank you for listening to Heroes and Humans of Football. For more information, go to our website at heroesandhumans.com.
And follow us at Heroes and Humans on all social platforms.
Next week's episode is about Pep Guardiola, the human being who became a GOAT. Please give it a listen. New episodes every Thursday.
This show was developed by Immaterial and produced by One Fine Play. Matt Cheney is the series producer. Kazra Firuzia is the editor and producer. We have been your hosts, Mehreen Khan
and Simon Cooper.
And this has been Heroes and Humans of Football.